Okay, start of a series of videos looking at creating a relational database in Microsoft Access. This will be tailored for level 3 BTEC students in terms of tools and techniques that they will need to be able to complete their coursework. But I imagine that if anyone else is looking at databases, using databases, starting out in databases, it would probably be fairly useful for them as well. So let's start off with a blank database, and I'm just going to save this. It's a good place to save this. I'm going to save this just in this OneDrive here, and I'm going to do it for the Blobfish Conservation Society because why not? I'm just going to call it Blobfish. I should probably give it a slightly longer and more full name, but um, that will do for now. If you're using a shared network, do double check the save location as to where the database is being saved automatically, and make sure you do it on this screen before you create the database. Otherwise, you have to go hunting for the database, and it's just massively easier to do it on this stage and get it in the right place to start with. So let's press the create button. Now we have access, and it starts off by giving us a single table. Now, there's a lot of stuff that we can do working in the fields that we've got and adding fields in this view, but it's usually better to work in terms of adding records and adding fields um, by going into the design view for the database. And we can do that by clicking on this button on the home tab that we've got, on the fields tab that we've got here. And it will ask us to save the table. Now, this table is going to have this database, sorry, is going to have 3 tables. So let's have the adopters table. So we should really prefix it TBL, and then how you set table names out after you've put the TBL in is up to you, so long as you're consistent throughout the database with how you name things. So I tend to use underscores. You could put spaces in. You could have it so that there is no space. Um, you could control things by using different types of capitalization. As long as you're consistent throughout your database, that should give you a good setup and a good start point. And the same will apply when we do forms, queries, and reports as well for this. So let's just add this adopter table. Now you should have, before putting anything into Access, have put in into it a lot of design elements. So you should have an entity relationship diagram. You should have an entity relationship diagram. You should have a data dictionary, and you should have done data normalization to the third normal form. Without those things, when it comes to creating the database, you are making your life 10 times harder than it needs to be. So let's start off with our ID field. Now, I do like putting a word in front of the ID field so that I know which ID field it is when it comes to working between tables later on. And I'm not going to put all of the information in here that we would necessarily have in this, because this is only a brief example. So let's do title, forename and surname. Let's have a phone number, preferably with correct spelling. And I need to be consistent in this, so I'm going to take that space out and put an underscore in. I'm also going to correct my spelling up there. Name, surname, phone number, and let's have date of birth in there as well. So there's a very, very small number of fields for information that we would probably need held on someone who was making an adoption of a blobfish, but it is enough for what we need to do. The next bit that we might want to look at is the data type. So short text gives us 255 characters at the bottom here. If we wanted to give a space where people can write notes into it, that will be a long text field. You've got a number field and a large number field, and the amount of digits it takes will define which is a number and which is a large number. You've got date and time fields, currency, auto number should really only be used for a primary key. We tend not to need to automatically increase something by 1 if it's not a unique identifier anyway. A yes or no field, which is a Boolean field, and that will give you a tick box to use. OLE object, which allows us to put pictures inline into our database. Hyperlinks, I'd say probably fairly straightforward. They allow you to insert web links, upload attachments. You've got a calculated field, which will take information from other fields and output the sum of the information depending on what calculation you have put in. And a lookup wizard, which allows us to create drop-down menus and create lookups in our databases without putting in a large amount of effort. So title, forename, and surname, definitely short text. Anything that is alphanumeric or has both letters and numbers would also fall into a short text data type. So short text is short text and long text are alphanumeric fields. Now, phone numbers, most people would automatically go, oh, it's a number, and put it in as a number field. Firstly, you'd have to put it in as a large number field because it's actually too long. It'll be too big a number to be held in a number field. The other problem with that is if we were to put it as a number, where phone numbers start with 0, it wouldn't actually keep the 0 at the front, thus giving us an invalid invalid phone number. And I'll show you that in a second. Date of birth, fairly straightforward, date time field. So I'm just going to save that for a second and go back to our datasheet view. So phone number field, we can see it's got a 0 in there. And I'm just going to put in a short number that starts with a 0 and watch what happens when I click off that cell. The 0 has disappeared. So although a phone number, yes, it is a number, we actually want to store it as short text and use validation to make it so that the user of the database can only enter a number in the correct format into that field. The other tables that we want to create, we now need to go into the Create tab and select Table. And that will give us a new table already set up on the Fields view for the setup. Go back into Design View again. I'm going to call this one Fish because we can't adopt anything can't adopt a fish without having a fish to adopt. And I'm going to click OK on that. And I'm going to put fish underscore ID in here. Fish name with the underscore. And we'll do the fish gender as well. And keeping it consistent, I'm making sure that even if I've not put the underscore in straight away, when I've typed it straight into the field, I've gone back and I've added underscores into each of my field names so that they are a match all the way through. Now you wouldn't necessarily have to put fish in front of these, but what I do find is by putting the table name with an underscore in front of the cells in front of the field names, when I'm creating queries and reports from queries, it makes it a lot easier to know exactly which date of birth I'm looking at, whose forename I'm looking at. So this is a very small database, but if you imagine if you had members of staff that you were keeping in this, I've just realised I've made a mistake with keeping things formatted the same. I haven't put table in front of fish. I will correct that in a moment. But if you imagine if you had staff members, they're going to have the same information as these adopters have. And if we were just to have forename and surname, when it came up, if we pulled forename and surnames up for adopters and members of staff in a report, we're not going to know which one's which. So I tend to put the table name in front of the name of the field so that when I'm working outside of those fields, or when I'm working with reports and queries, I know which table those fields have come from. I'm going to save my fish table and just close that for a second, because if you do forget, you need to close the table on the top bar, right click on the table and go to rename. And that will allow you then to add in the missing prefix to the tables. So one more table in this, and let's go to design view, and this is going to be adoption, and it's going to be TBL underscore adoption underscore records, preferably with correct spelling. I'm going to click OK on that. And I'm actually just going to leave that as an ID for the moment. And we're going to want to put in the adopter ID, because this is where we're going to set up the links between the tables, so we don't have to duplicate the data in these first two tables. I'm going to want to close the adopter table as well, while I remember. We're going to want the fish ID, because that is the primary key, which is going to make the link. We want to set both of these to number. And for now, let's just do an adoption start date. And we'll change that one to a date time field. And I'm not going to worry about this field and putting anything in here. And I will explain why in a later video. But for now, let's put in the relationships. So to do the relationships, click on your foreign key field. So this adopter ID here is a foreign key in this table, and it's going to get the information from the adopter table about the person adopting the fish. So in the adopter ID, which is going to be a foreign key, we're going to want to go to the lookup wizard, which will bring up this dialog box. We want to get the values from another table because we want to create the relationships between the tables. Press the next button. Then we choose the table that we want to get the information from. Now, because I'm doing the adopter ID, the adopter table is the one that's already selected, so I can go straight next on that one. Then it asks you what fields you want to include. Always put the ID field over. If nothing else, it's good practice and a good backup because the ID field is the one that creates the actual link. And for this one, I'm going to put the forename and the surname over so that I can recognize which person it is out of my list of people who are adopting fish in this case, and I can recognize which person it is from the list of names. The next screen gives you the option to sort your data. So I'm going to sort this using the surname first and then using the forename. Now there's no information here because I've not got any records in my database. And at this stage, because I've not inputted any information, I would expect this to be blank. But you can choose whether or not you want to hide the column that contains a primary key, which is this ID field. Most people don't know their reference number. You have a reference number for an account on something like Amazon or eBay. You have a reference number for a gym membership. You probably don't know what that is. So showing the key column, generally speaking, is not really something that you need to do. So leave that one ticked. It makes it a lot nicer and easier for the user when they're looking at the information in the drop-down. The final screen probably has the most important bit for setting up a relationship using a lookup, and that is this enable data integrity. If enable data integrity is not selected, the user will be able to enter information into that field that does not exist in the related table. So if I had someone, if I only had a person called Bob in my adopter table and someone came along to the adoption records and put in an adoption record for someone called Jane, if that wasn't enabled, then they would be able to do that. And someone comes along and looks up this Jane that's adopted whatever fish, and they can't find any information on her. So we want to enable the data integrity. You then are given two options. You can cascade delete or you can restrict delete. Cascade delete will delete any records that are related to a record in the primary table. So if I go back to Bob in our adoption table, if I was to delete Bob, any records in the adoption records table, which is the one that I'm setting up this link in, would also be deleted when Bob is deleted. The other option that you've got is restrict delete. I tend to leave it on restrict delete because that way, if I try to delete Bob, it will come up and say that Bob has records in related tables. So I can make sure that Bob definitely wants to be deleted and wants to cancel, in this case, his remaining adoptions. It might be cancel any related gym memberships or add-on packs to a product or service. But that way I can check to make sure that Bob has realized that he has XYZ and all of those will be deleted and given the option to say, oh no, actually just want to cancel this one bit. But you need, if nothing else, to make sure that data integrity is enabled for the relationships. When you press finish, it will say table must be saved. You do need to make sure that the only table you have open is the table you're creating the foreign key relationships in before you start. Press yes to save the table. Now that will still say number. But if we go back to the datasheet view and I click in the adopter ID, instead of it having a 0 in, when like the fish ID does here, it will have a drop down. And when I put information into my adopter table, save the adopter table and reopen the adoption records, that will be populated with the names that are in that adoption table. And then you do the same thing for the fish ID. So making sure that the fish table isn't open, I can go to the lookup wizard, select the query. This time I want the fish table, I want the ID field and the name. I'm going to sort it by the name, don't need to sort it by the ID. The ID is not going to be shown, so it's just going to show the fish name. I've got no record, so there's nothing in there at the moment. On to enable data integrity, choose whether I want to cascade delete or restrict delete. Press finish, save the table, and now when I go back to the datasheet view, the 0 has gone and it's got the drop down ready. In order to view the relationships, go to the database tools, click on the button that says relationships. If the relationships come up and they're not showing, you would need to go to add tables, and you might get this docked, like mine has come up on the right hand side, or you might get this as a floating pop-up. Doesn't matter which one it does, double click the tables or click the table and add selected tables when you selected the tables to put them into the database. To put them into the relationship view, sorry, they're already in the database. If the relationships don't show up, and you've definitely done the steps before this, move one of the tables, preferably the one with the preferably one with foreign keys in, just to be sure. But that should then, if the database relationships have been set up, put the relationships back into view. And then what you're looking for in this view is you are looking for a 1 relationship from the primary key. So you're looking for a 1 there, going to a many-ended relationship with the connected foreign key. And that is the basic setup of a database before we start putting in any kind of validation to check what users are entering into the database is correct. And that will be in the next video.